This Valentine's Day.
I am love. I am worthy of love.
Permission to Love's Jerry Henderson is on Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers in a heartfelt conversation all about love.
Why have we normalized self-hate and self-criticism and we haven't normalized self-love?
The love of self. We want this love, but we're unwilling to give it to ourselves. The love of others.
We talk about loving others as we love ourselves, but if there's not a lot of love in this tank, there's not a lot of love to give to other people.
And the love we want to spread in this world.
Your love will heal you, and your love will unleash the best version of you. And I don't know anybody who would say that the best version of me wouldn't be about loving other people and bringing goodness into this world.
On an all-new Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers, a podcast dedicated to those seeking a more fulfilled and purposeful life through thought-provoking conversation, spiritual exploration, and authentic connections. The intentional movement has begun, and if you found yourself here, you are a part of it. Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers starts now. Hi, Jerry. Welcome to Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. I am so honored to have you here today and have a different voice on the show. Like I said, as we were jumping on, a lot of times we talk to women, but I love opening the conversation up to men and getting different perspectives. And I think you have a beautiful perspective of like how we really get to know ourselves and embrace this idea of self-love. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's really a gift to be here. Really admire all the work that you're doing, Courtney, with Intentional Living to raise awareness, to talk about the issues of spirituality and just to kind of really help this movement of awakening, right, to our inner self and then being able to be here and talk about loving ourselves and accepting ourselves. And you're right. I mean, guys don't talk about it a lot. And I hope to be somewhat of a voice to help normalize the conversation of self-love, not just among men, but among many, circles, and just to kind of help people see that self-love's not selfish, it's not narcissism. I mean, all the things that we've heard, but yet there still seems to be this sense of feeling a little bit guilty about self-love, or all the things that our culture and other things have trained us to not really be able to feel comfortable doing that. So I'm grateful to be able to be here and help be a voice for that space, and hopefully it can help people along the way.
Well, I think you nailed it on the head just there. Like that guilt to allow ourselves to be loving of ourselves. It's like we are so inbred to like not love ourselves. We want this love from the outside world, but we're unwilling to give it to ourselves. And I don't understand where that stems from, why we're just kind of like, we don't want to be our own champion. And we're looking outside of us for these champions. But like you said, it's not selfish. My mentor actually tells me this all the time. She's like, be self-interested. It's not selfish, it's self-interested. And so that's an interesting perspective. Like we have to embrace ourselves. We have to love ourselves to be able to give love to anyone else, let alone receive it.
Yeah. Totally agree. So in my opinion, it's like the exact opposite, right? It's actually, if we're not self-loving, if we're not self-inquiring, and we're not curious about ourselves, that we're actually not just robbing ourselves of the beauty of who we are, but we're robbing other people as well. And so it's one of the more unselfish things that you can do to learn who you are, to love who you are, because you're going to show up better in this world. You're going to have capacity to love others. We talk about loving others as we love ourselves. But if there's not a lot of love in this tank, there's not a lot of love to give to other people. And so I think we're actually going around like this quasi-love with other people. And we're trying to give something to people. We're trying to give love. And I think that's why we see a lot of breakdown in relationships. We see a lot of, challenges, because we're going at this place of trying to love other people with the energy that we're not even giving to ourselves. And so it's often not coming from an authentic place. And so being able to love ourselves and love ourselves deeply and fully accept ourselves, really super unselfish thing to do. It's a very it's a gift that we can give this world to be able to do that. So yeah.
So how do we start to build that love of self? Because I mean, it's great. I think we come in the world with it. We do love ourselves. We are self-interested when we come into this world. But as we grow, we're told, do, like you said, give to others, do for others. And we don't really take care of ourselves. And so it becomes so ingrained in us that I don't even think we understand what self-love means, let alone who we are authentically and what we should even like about ourselves. Like that inner critic, the negative bias, like we just go there. And I know I'm talking like, and big, on big picture, but like,
Yeah.
I think this is bigger than just like this little circle of people. I think the majority of us go there are like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you're so right that we are inherently born with love for self. And we get trained, we get programmed to see that as something that we shouldn't do. And I think it's just a lot of society. I think it's a lot of what is happening with others projecting their own shame on us. And so we begin to absorb that. It's definitely something that trauma does to us. Trauma, we talk about that trauma is not what happens to you, but it's what happens in you. And what happens in you is you make decisions, right? You make a decision about life. How is life? If this is how I'm being treated, then life must be unfair or cruel. Or if this is how other people are treating me, then I can't really trust people. And then if people are treating me this way, then there must be something wrong with me. And then how can I love this, which is being told or being shown that it's unlovable by the way that I'm being treated, or by the culture that says in order for you to be loved, you have to do X, Y, and Z. You have to show up this way. You can't be your authentic self. And so learning to love ourselves, I think first and foremost is realizing that it is programming. It is training. I remember a very distinct moment for me. I was in the shower, our shower thoughts, right? There, and you just got in that moment. And I was beating myself up after I just committed that morning to not do that to myself. And it was like, I realized in that second, it was just like this little gift that was given to me from my inner self, my higher part of me that said, you're addicted to beating yourself up. You have an addiction to shame. And I just paused and I began to really study that and realize that, addiction to shame, addiction to beating ourselves up, and addiction to being an inner critic makes a lot of sense when you realize that our thoughts produce chemicals and those chemicals produce emotions. And then those emotions start a cycle of another thought and then another emotion. And so it gets this loop. We actually get addicted to feeling bad about ourselves. And so when I realized that, it totally freed me in that moment, because what I realized was it wasn't that there was something wrong with me. It wasn't that I was bad and unlovable. I was just trained a certain way as a child, as from society. And I'd become addicted, just like any other addiction, to a certain way of feeling about myself. And then if I could realize that, and if I was trained and addicted, then I could change that. Then I could heal that. And so I think that's the first place that we have to start, realizing that it's not that there's something wrong with you, that you're unlovable. You're trained, you're programmed, you're addicted to a certain way of feeling and thinking, potentially. And that's great news, because it allows us to use tools to change it. So, yeah.
Wow, that is such a great way to look at it, as that we are addicted to that, because we do become addicted. And I've talked about that on the show before. Like, we don't choose to change because we're more comfortable in, even if we're in a horrible situation, a messy situation, like things aren't great, we're just so comfortable in it. Like, we don't know what's on the other side of like what could be better. And so that's scary. So we'd rather just sit in our mess. Whereas like, that's the same kind of concept. We're addicted to these thoughts and emotions. And I mean, think about it, not only with like self-love, with like gossiping with friends or things like that. There's just so many like things that don't seem so bad. It's not like you're saying, oh, I'm addicted to alcohol or drugs, which, we have to treat it the same way. Maybe we do need to treat our addiction to negative self-talk the same way as we would, an addiction to a substance. Is that how we can start to reverse course?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of goodness in that approach. For me, I'm a recovering alcoholic, right? And my trauma that led to the shame, that led to the self-hatred and self-loathing, created an environment for me that I felt like I needed to escape myself. Being with me was so uncomfortable and intolerable that I used alcohol in order to get away from myself, to escape. I tell people that, I drank in order to tolerate my own presence. What I was really trying to do, though, was to silence the voice inside of me, that inner critic, and medicate that. And so I was medicating the source of that pain, and the pain was the inner critic. But there's a beautiful question, right? I ask people, don't ask, how you can control or manage your drinking or your addiction. Ask the question, what is that addiction helping you manage? Right? So it's helping you manage something. And so that then creates a place of love and kindness towards yourself instead of judgment. And then you can go a layer deeper and go, okay, so now I'm trying to manage the inner critic. Okay, what's the inner critic trying to do for me? How is the inner critic trying to serve me? I'm a big believer that everything we do and the voice in our head and the decisions we make are all about trying to serve us and all about survival mode. So if you can look at the inner critic and go, well, how are you trying to serve me? How are you trying to keep me safe? Because that will then begin to unpack a whole level of other things where we go, well, as a child, potentially, it wasn't safe for me to be myself. It wasn't safe for me to express my potential. And so I heard the criticism from others, and I need to keep myself in check. And so that inner critic kind of helps pull me back from the beauty. And I love the quote about that we're not actually afraid of, the bad parts of ourselves. We're actually afraid of all of the greatness that's in us, all of the potential that's inside of us. I think the inner critic serves us. The shame and the judgment serves us by trying to pull us back from who we actually are, because we're afraid of who we actually are. We've been trained to be afraid of that greatness that's in us. And so I think treating it like an addiction, then that allows it to be softened, right? Because it goes, oh, there's something that I can heal here. For me, the big thing for people who deal with shame and trauma is you 100% got to come at yourself with gentleness and kindness, because you can't heal the voice of an inner critic with the voice of another inner critic, right? We try to tell ourselves, man, shut up, stop talking to yourself. And we beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up. We're just keeping the same loop. And that kindness and gentleness, just like we would with any other health issue, any other challenge in our life, will begin to open us up, open up that heart, open up our space to begin to receive our own love and our own healing. So, that's been my experience.
But that's so true. Like, we beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up. That's just perpetuating the cycle. But it's not like, if we are a person that beats ourselves up, like, it's not natural to go to that compassion or that empathy for self. So it's like, what if we don't know how to do that? Like, where do we find the tools to actually start, like, bringing that empathy and compassion into life? Like, a lot of it, like you said, may stem from your childhood or a trauma or something like that. And it's just so it's like we are wired. And I actually talked to, I think it was one of the biologists or someone I talked to, a psychotherapist. I've talked to a lot of people on the show, but they said, he's like, we are actually naturally wired to the negativity bias. Like, our brain, like you said, it keeps us safe. We go to that negativity bias because even back in caveman days, like if your grandma was like, or your great, whatever, however far back you need to go, grandma was like, oh, that rustling in the leaves, maybe it's a nice little bunny rabbit coming by, and it's a tiger. They're gone 2 minutes later. So like, we are so far wired to think of the worst. How do we reverse and start to introduce the compassion?
Yeah, for me, my journey was one, and people I coach and work with, is just starting with number one, awareness, right? Awareness of what you just said, that we're trained that way. We have actual internal, bias that pushes us that way. And the challenge is we get, and that's great when it becomes survival mode physically, right? You're actually out in an endangered environment. And then you have the rest and the time where you're away from that, so you can kind of recover. But we're living in a culture where we're hit 24/7 with that unlovability factor, the who you need to be loved, or that inner critic that's in your head. And if that's your source of danger, and that's your source of stress, and that's your source of, discomfort, that's with you 24/7, right? And so you never escape. So that obviously begins to affect our, stress levels and all of our other parts physically. And so there's so much that goes with that. And so it is about, number one, starting with that awareness that it's, once again, not something wrong with you. It's training, it's some wiring, it's all of those things, because that'll begin to release that feeling that this is impossible. I can't overcome this because it's me. I'm what's flawed. And how do I get away from what's flawed? I have to live with it and realizing, no, that's not the case. And then number two, what worked for me was then saying, okay, now how do I reprogram that part of me? How do I begin to move away from the inner critic, which felt so natural to me? It was just like me. I felt like that was me. So first I had to realize I'm not my thoughts, right? We hear a lot about that, Michael Singer's book, Untethered Soul. I mean, there's just so many, Eckhart Tolle and others who talk a lot about you are not your thoughts. And we're so identified with our thinking that when we have an inner critic thought or a negative thought about ourselves, we go, oh, well, that must be true because I'm saying it about myself. And so the de-identification from the thoughts that then allows me to go, oh, I can change my thoughts because I have a brain that does what a brain does. It produces thoughts. And I don't go around and say I'm my liver. I have a liver. It's an organ that produces, or that cleanses my system. So I'm not walking around going, I'm my liver. But I do go around saying, like, thinking that I am what I think. But we're not. And so we start there as well to go, you are not your thoughts. And then how do I begin to reprogram thoughts, right? And so there's a real discomfort for me, at least, and for others that I work with and coach, that when they first try to change those thoughts, it feels so uncomfortable to look yourself in the mirror and say, I love you. It feels so like untrue. Doesn't feel even like, like reality. It feels like I'm lying to myself. Got to realize that reprogramming feels uncomfortable. Right. And so when we are reprogramming ourselves, our systems will like try to reject it and spit it out. And that's just simply because we've lived for 10, 20, 40, 50 years, however long, with a different set of programming. And now we have to have the same patience with ourselves to reprogram that we endured the programming of the negativity. Now we have to have that same endurance to program ourselves in the positive way. And I do a whole session with people about how they can begin to reprogram their thinking and what does that look like. So, yeah.
Wow. So is this kind of like where that whole concept of like reparenting yourself comes in? Because I mean, a lot of these, not saying that everyone had this traumatic childhood or this horrible childhood, but our perceptions, how we perceive whatever situation was, or some little comment, some offhanded comment someone might have made to us in our childhood can change the trajectory of our entire life, even if it wasn't meant to be mean or off-putting. Like, we can internalize that, and that can create that negative wiring, like you say. So is it like this treating ourselves like a baby, essentially, or a toddler, like relearning what connection is?
Absolutely. And having deep, deep levels of compassion for that part of yourself, to be able to see that part of yourself that heard those words, that heard that you're unlovable or unworthy or whatever the joke was or whatever the thing was that was said to you that stuck with you, that you can immediately think of, and then it triggers all those feelings again. Got to have compassion for that part of you that experienced that and see that part with love. I was working with an executive out of New York, and he was like, well, I didn't ever experience like major childhood trauma, but I was always, being pressured to do this or that, or I was having to compare myself with the performance of, my brothers and my dad's expectations, and this would happen. I said, no, I said two things. One, we don't want to get into comparative trauma. Right? Like, oh, well, your trauma was worse than my trauma, so why can't I deal with what happened to me? You seem to be doing okay with what happened to you. Comparative trauma, once again, it's not what happens to us, but what happens in us. And so, and those things that happen in us are made at a very subconscious level, right? That nanosecond, the decisions are made about what just happened to us. And then that then begins to give us a certain belief system about ourselves. Those experiences create these, core beliefs about who we are. And then those core beliefs drive our behaviors and our decisions. And so being able to go back to that experience and not get into comparative trauma and go, you know what? That was traumatic to me. It stuck with me. And what happened to me is it changed the way that I saw myself. And so the other, real challenge around, comparative trauma is we talk about macro trauma a lot, abuse, tragic situations that happen, but there's micro traumas that happen all along the path that start to stack up. And we get so unaware of them, just, like we were talking about a person that earlier, that those things begin to stack up. And we're not even aware that all that stuff is layered on us because they've been micro things, but they're still developing, these experiences that lead to core beliefs, that lead to how we view ourselves, that lead to how we show up in this life. So, yeah.
I mean, I think that is so huge to realize because, you know, a lot of us will be like, no, we had this wonderful childhood or we had this wonderful experience, but these micro traumas. And I talked actually to someone who specializes in PTSD and went through some
Mm.
major traumas in her life and how it showed up in her, like the fact that she didn't even realize that. And even like you were saying, we were talking before we jumped on, and a person in my life that we were talking about, like, we minimize these things that happen to us that we don't even look at them like, oh, that was a traumatic experience or that wasn't good for me.
Yeah.
And it's like we don't allow ourselves to say that, like, no, this impacted me in a big way and it has impacted the way I go about my life. And these traumas, like, really do create this self-loathing versus self-love.
Yeah.
And so we do that awareness, and then of being like, seriously, when I had that conversation that I was telling you about the other day, it was just kind of like, no, I don't, you know, the person I was talking to said, oh, no, I don't have any traumas. And I was like, are you serious? I listed off like major traumas. It's like anyone who experienced one of those things would be like, oh my goodness, you know, I have to go through years and years of therapy to deal with.
Right.
But it's those micro traumas that we even minimize more, that we don't realize. And it changes our perception of everything. And it could be like a joke at our expense as a child. Like, it shapes our whole life.
It does. Yeah. It happens. Something shifts within us, and we can't minimize that. Because here's the challenge. We don't want to admit that we have trauma, because if we admit that we have trauma, then that means we've got some work to do. And that means that there's some things that are showing up in our lives that maybe are, you know, affecting the way that we're acting and the way, and if we can kind of ignore that and put that in the closet, then we can kind of ignore it, right? And then the other thing is, we don't want to be labeled as a person who's had trauma, right? Because historically, we've lived in a culture where having that label means that there's something wrong with you, that there's something broken about you. You know, and I'm, you know, 53. And so for me, as a male, as a 53-year-old male, my generation, trauma, we didn't talk about trauma. And as a guy, you didn't talk about trauma. And so to say that you experienced trauma, and to own that, and to be willing to do the work on it, and then being okay with being labeled and looked at a certain way, that's a lot of courage. And so I want to encourage people that if you're in that place, you are courageous. You are not weak in admitting that you have those things that you want to heal and that need to heal in your life. Because, you know, I know for me, when I was with my therapist and had just started therapy, was out of rehab, and that was all the things that trauma had done to me. I mean, it took me to a place where I had a quadruple bypass because I was having, you know, such heart issues, had a heart attack, had to have open heart surgery, couldn't figure out how to work in relationships. So went through two divorces, was an alcoholic. I mean, everything was falling apart over like this 16-month period. And so when I came out of rehab and went into some really intensive therapy, one of the things that my therapist asked me to do was to talk about my trauma. And I was like, you know, I had stuff in childhood was my approach. By the time I got done unpacking what had happened to me, you know, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the poverty that I grew up in, everything that was going on in my life, my therapist said, you know, I've been working with people for decades, and on a scale of 1 to 10, you're like a 9 or a 9.5 on the level of trauma that I've heard people tell me about. And she said, and it's interesting to me that you described it as some stuff happened in childhood. Well, that's a protective thing to do for ourselves, right? And so we've got to be willing to get past that layer of protection and allow ourselves to heal.
Well, I think you said something really important when you said you have to have the courage, because we do live in a society that doesn't welcome talking about our traumas, talking about what happens. We live in a society that wants to just medicate everything. Like you said, I mean, alcohol is like what is being said about it right now. It's like the most accepted form, like the most accepted drug. It's like pushed on us. And even talking about alcoholism, you know, I know people in my life who struggle with it. My husband actually decided a couple of years ago to do this challenge 75 hard, where you didn't drink for 70. It was part of it was you didn't drink alcohol for 75 days. And he loved the effects of it so much that he hasn't gone back to alcohol, but it's caused issues in other relationships of our life because alcohol is so pushed. I mean, it's like this coping mechanism that we welcome into it. And I don't know if it's because it removes that discomfort of sitting, having these authentic conversations or getting real, or what it does. But I know I probably had a challenge with it through my 20s and 30s because I was deeply uncomfortable with who I was. I wasn't being myself. I was lonely. I didn't know how I wanted to show up in the world. And so I drank. And,
Yeah.
now it's kind of like one of those things is I have a glass of wine with a nice dinner once every 6 months here or there, like randomly. But I am so much more comfortable with who I am and having conversations like this that I don't even want it anymore. So it's very weird how we use these crutches and they're socially acceptable as opposed to having the courage to have these real open dialogues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're so right. Courage to have the open dialogue, courage to feel uncomfortable, courage to not run away, the courage to be able to go ahead and say, you know what, it's okay if people label me a certain way. I need to heal, and my healing is more important than wondering what people think about me. I mean, I had to draw some lines in the sand. And there's a lot of conversation right now around, is the word trauma being like overused, and are people using the word trauma? We're hearing it everywhere, and I wonder, where that's coming from. And I get from the professional space, and there's certain diagnosis that is, often connected to. And I get that some people are concerned that people are using that label in order to justify whatever behaviors. But for me, it's like, I'm not really as concerned about people overusing the word trauma. I'm actually concerned about people not using the word trauma when they need to, and then being afraid to use the label of trauma for themselves because they're afraid somebody's going to be like, oh, well, you're just using that label. Or all of a sudden, we're putting it in such a negative light now in some sense because people feel like it's being overused. But I still feel like it's way underused. I feel like people have experienced so many things that they don't want to honor themselves to be able to say, yeah, what happened to me was traumatic. Because until we name it, and until we're ready to see it and to face it, we don't heal it. It's a great book by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Perry that talk about it's not what happened. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what's happened to you. That's the question that we need to be asking. Not like what's wrong with this person or what's wrong with me, but what happened to me that is causing this narrative and this story to show up in my life. And then if I can face that, name it, then I can start to heal it. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so interesting that people would think that trauma is being overused because there are some terms like this, creating boundaries or gratitude or manifesting, there's a lot of words in this wellness space that we're both in that get thrown around a lot. But I think the issue is it's not the words. The words are triggering, but it's because I don't think we truly understand what they mean. Like you said, I think comparative trauma is like comparing traumas does not serve anyone. And I think that's maybe where that comes in. And even if professionals are saying, don't label this as trauma, I mean, that's a disservice to us because everyone's perception of what happened to them is going to be totally different. We are living in a world where we are just creating our own stories by how we perceive situations. Like we are living in that space. So, I mean, if something was traumatic to someone and I don't think it's traumatic to them, I shouldn't diminish how they feel. Like that was their experience. And we need to have compassion for each other. And when we can do that, maybe we can start to look at ourselves and have compassion for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think often we're mirroring, right? My lack of compassion for myself, I'm often projecting on other people, not giving them compassion. And it is so true. And I want to go back to that thought of, I can't judge your level of what you experienced in that moment. Two people can go through the absolute same experience and they'll have totally different internal experiences and responses to it. And that's based off of environment. It's based off of who they are. It's based off a ton of things that they are not even in control of in that moment. And this is one thing that we'll judge ourselves for is we'll say, that happened. And then all of a sudden I felt this way. And then it started to do this. And I started to replay it in my mind. And now all of a sudden it's impacting me. Listen, give yourself the compassion to know that when that moment happened and when that internal decision got made and that internal response happened, you were not in control of what happened in that moment. Your body, your brain were responding. Now we're in control later of Are we going to heal? Are we going to face it? Are we going to, continue to do the work to let that not control us anymore? But that initial response, I'm very, very adamant about that. That was not a conscious decision that's made. It's a survival decision that's made. And then that survival decision gets unfolded later, and really, can cause some real challenges in our life. And as a result of that, it awakens us, and those challenges awaken us to see that we have some work to do and that we can heal, and then use that story for transformation for ourselves and for others. So.
I mean, and that's how you'll see children that grow up in the same household can have such different lives and experiences. Because I've seen that lately is like, someone can look at a childhood, go through the same exact thing as a brother or sister. And one will say, I had so much trauma. The other one doesn't. Like we experience things so individually. I've even seen, I think, a meme, like, you grow up with an alcoholic father, what that makes one brother, I'm an alcoholic because of my father. The other one said, I don't drink alcohol because of my father. I mean, it's two extremes, but it's how they take that situation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is how that situation is taken, and then it's the whole thing that begins to unfold, and the narrative that starts, and then the self-judgment and the self-loathing, like we talked about in the beginning. And then we've got to realize that if that experience, caused that, and that experience caused all these things to unfold, there's also the beautiful story that new experiences can cause different new core beliefs to develop and new ways of being able to see ourselves. And so threading it back to what experiences cause that to happen, and then being committed to having new experiences to rewire core beliefs and to emotionally reprogram our brains. I love the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, where he talks about in our rewiring process, not only is it a thought that we have to think, but then there's the emotion that we need to attach to it. Because in that moment of trauma, or in that moment of whatever painful life experience that happened, there was emotion that happened. And when we replay it in our mind, emotions come back up around it. Yeah. And then when we start to beat ourselves up and, judge ourselves and say there's something wrong with us, there's a whole bunch of emotion. There's a whole bunch of emotions that are happening as a result of that. And so same thing's going to have to happen in reprogramming ourselves to learning to love ourselves, is that we're going to have to be able to say, I love myself, to think that thought, and then to try to feel the emotion that goes with it. Because that emotion is what's going to help, put those grooves, right? And strengthen those neural pathways and that wiring to really start to believe that you love yourself. I went for like 6 months on this one thing that I was trying to rewire in my brain about the feeling of not being enough, right? The whole imposter syndrome. Here I am, fairly successful in life and still feeling like I'm a nothing, feeling like I'm the stupidest guy in the room. And it took me like 6+ months just to begin to move that needle to not feel like that. And it was daily saying to myself, I am enough. I love you just as you are. And when I first started it felt really awkward, really dumb, really strange. And I just kept at it. And then I started to attach the emotion to it and really feeling that emotion. And I would say it until I started to feel some type of emotion. And then what happened was, I remember one day in saying it and doing that mantra, I felt something internally actually shift. It was like I physically felt something shift. And so I try to encourage people to stay at it, to not give up on it, because in that rewiring, you're not just rewiring the way you think, you're actually rewiring your body that has stored that trauma and stored that belief system inside of you. And as you're practicing the rewiring, you might even feel the physical sensations of that. And then in that moment was when I was like, wow, I'm actually starting to believe that. And it's been a long time since I've had a thought different from that, because now that pathway is the one that my brain wants to go to, instead of the one that says that, I'm not worthy. So, yeah.
I mean, that's amazing, because I think that's the next step. We talk about affirmations, and you can look at yourself in the mirror and say all the positive things you want. You can write all those things down, but if you don't feel it, you're not going to believe it. So it's bringing that feeling into whatever it is you're saying. And that's
Yeah.
so impactful, because think of anything in our life that evokes a feeling. A song can take you right back to a place. Any sort of emotion
Mm-hmm.
of any scenario will take you back to that place. And it's like almost you go back into that rewiring. So we have to attach the feeling with the positive emotions to help us rewire ourselves. And that's with everything,
Yeah.
like creating the narrative of our life. We have to
Yep.
recreate the emotional aspect, our emotional body in that.
Yeah, we do. And we're comfortable with that, right? When we say, hey, when I want to like physically retrain myself, or I want to do this or that, I know that, there's all these things that I need to do in order to do that. But when it comes to the area of self-love and being able to love ourselves and give compassion and kindness and acceptance to ourselves, we have a disconnect around going, well, maybe I should use the same, principles that I'm using in other places of success or, physical things, to go, well, let me use those same principles and apply it to that space. I work with people on this thing I call the FAST method. People are like, it ain't happening fast enough. I'm trying to give up on this, or I've been at it for like a month and I still feel terrible about myself. And I'm saying the positive things and I don't feel good about myself still. And so I say, well, okay, let's put 4 things together. And I say FAST just because, it's an acronym. And also it's like, I think this is one of the faster ways to help us rewire that belief. And it's a combination of the feelings, but also actions. And I'll unpack this here in a second. Then what we say, and then what we think. I mean, all those things together. Because if I want to start believing and feeling good about myself and loving myself and fully accepting myself, there's a feeling that goes with that. I mean, that's what we're after at the end of the day, right? Ours, that feeling. I want to feel a certain way about myself. I want to stop feeling so terrible about myself. But then we go into action, because your brain doesn't just believe what you say. It actually believes what you do. It needs to see you taking some type of action, because the brain that just sits there and thinks something, yes, we all know manifestation. We know the visualization and how that needs to become a reality. We'll talk about that in the thought part of it. But I need to also see myself acting, because I need to see that I actually believe this. And one of the biggest ways to do that is to take an action, some type of self-loving action towards yourself. Then the S, the saying, or something that I'm speaking about myself. What do I say about myself? We'll notice it almost default wise. We'll get a compliment and we'll brush it off. Nah, it's okay. I really didn't do that great at the presentation. So what I'm saying is I'm hearing, and then I'm thinking, and then I'm feeling, and then I'm acting. And the next way I show up in the presentation, I've got all those emotions right before it that are making me feel like I'm going to fail on this thing. And then the last one, thinking, visualizing, and tying all that together is really a part of how do we rewire ourselves to learn to love ourselves. So.
I love that. I love that you call it fast, because one, I'm an impatient person, and we all live in this world of like Amazon, let's Amazon our feelings, let's Amazon everything on demand. But also, I mean, I had a conversation with another person who we talked about like meditation. And she's like, I've been doing this self-help thing for years, and people will come to me, oh, I've been meditating for the last 30 days. I don't feel any different. She's like, okay, talk to me in 3 years. Some of these self-care practices that we're doing in our life don't show up for like a decade later. Like, we're building this foundation. And if we really truly think about it, where we are in our thought process now, or that self-hate or self-loathing, whatever we may be dealing with at this moment, it didn't happen overnight. I mean, like you said, you're 53, I'm 41, our thoughts have been compounded, just like we were talking about those micro traumas. It's like, we're not going to change them immediately. And I even liken it to dieting. I mean, it took me 9 months to gain that baby weight. Why do I think it's going to take me 3 weeks to lose it? It's like, we have to realize that, like, we have to give ourselves the compassion and time to work through these things. And it's not going to happen fast, but we do have to take the actions to make the changes. And that's where it will start.
Yeah. Be as patient in your healing as you were in tolerating your suffering, right? We tolerated suffering for decades, and yet we want overnight healing, like you said. And, I'm, like I said, 53, and the reality is decades of training, decades of, thought patterns. But I have noticed that, the healing portion of it is an absolute lifetime journey for me. I mean, there's just no getting around that. But as we get intentional about connecting with truth about ourselves, I believe that truth gets more quickly wired in our system than falsehood. And we can begin to start really taking ourselves on a journey of healing. And that when I say fast, it's like, once again, I want to make sure people understand, I'm not saying that this is going to happen fast, but what we're trying to do is at least get a few quicker wins for you in the process. Because if you can at least go, wow, it's been 6 months, it's been 3 months, or it's been 2 months, I actually felt something. I felt love towards myself. I felt gratitude towards myself. I may have been the first time I've ever felt that. I remember the first time I ever said the words, I am worthy of my own love. And I came out of my mouth almost like unconsciously, subconsciously. But it did something to me. It was like, well, yeah, I am worthy of my own love. And why have I not thought that I'm worthy of my own love? And why is any person on this planet walking around feeling like that they shouldn't be loved? Why have we normalized self-hate and self-criticism, and we haven't normalized self-love? And so if we can get some of those quick wins, it'll help people stay on the path. Because once again, we're after that feeling. When we don't get that feeling, we're after life change, etc. But really, ultimately, we want to feel a certain way about ourselves. So trying to get some of those quick wins to go, see, you can make progress. There is change. And it's not that there's something wrong with you. There's some things that happen to you. And we wanted to address those and see some healing take place.
Yeah, we don't need to fix ourselves. We need to fix what's within so that we can be ourselves. But it's so funny that even talking about this, like this conversation shouldn't make me feel uncomfortable, but it's bringing up thoughts. And it's like making me feel uncomfortable about myself. Like I'm not worthy. Like when you're saying that stuff, it's like, you're right. We have normalized this side of ourselves, this like not thinking that we are worthy or lovable. And even hearing you say things like, oh, I love myself, or I'm, I have self-worth. Like immediately thoughts in my mind go to things like, conceit, guilt, shame, like all these bad, like terms. It's like, why do we go there? Like we put that self-love into that box of like, you think you're better than me, or you're arrogant, or, like all these negative things.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre.
It is bizarre, isn't it? And it's such a challenge because there's a lot of that I think is fear-based and working with people, because like, well, if I love myself, then wow, what happens? Am I going to become like a narcissist? Am I going to become like this or that? Or am I going to be like, are other people going to judge me and be like, who do you think you are? And so, or I've got the story in my head that's telling me all the reasons why I shouldn't love myself. I have the voices of others from childhood that tell you why you're not worthy. I have my decisions that I made that, I go, you know what? See, you did that. So you're definitely not lovable. You're definitely not worthy of it. Or I was in a relationship and somebody just, destroyed my, self-confidence and ability to love myself. And so all these messages and all this stuff. But if we can realize that those are experiences, those are stories, and that we can change those, we can reprogram those, and we can understand the sources of those stories. If somebody gave you a story, you can also choose to let go of that story. If you did something that you feel like you really proved that you're unlovable, that was an action that you took that's in the past. And you know what? You can take an action now that can show you and show to you that you are lovable. But the reality is, there's nothing that we need to do to prove that we're lovable. There is no list that says this makes me lovable, this makes me unlovable. That's all just kind of programming that we've adopted. We are lovable and worthy of love because we draw breath, because we exist. We don't need a list. I think that's the fallacy of it. We think that we have to have a unlovable list and a worthy of love list. And that when you start to do that, your brain will tell you more of the reasons why you're unlovable than you are lovable, because once again, we have the bias to looking for, the negative at times. But if you drop the list and you go, I don't have to have a list. I'm worthy because I draw breath. That is who I am. I am love. I am worthy of love. And then we get to address that fear. And the fear really is, once again, a protection mode. Anytime we get into fear, there's often the protection that we're trying to do for ourselves. and it's to not be labeled as, prideful person, or there's religious, components that go with that. There's a whole, training around that. But it's interesting when we think about the fear of narcissism. If we do the research, and Brene Brown's, work on this, that she'll actually tell you that narcissist is the absolutely most shame-filled individual, and that they're the ones that are the most inner critic and the loudest inner critic and the most shame, and that's why you have this unbelievable amount of overcompensation. And so if you're interested in that, you can see Dr. Brene Brown's work on narcissism and shame, and it being the most shame-based personality out there. So, yeah.
So do you think so many of us feel unlovable and don't find our self-worth because we are getting that projected back from one another?
Oh, that's a great point. Really. Yeah, I think so. Right. I mean, we do adopt each other's energy, right, at times, and we mirror, and there's the whole, balancing of, energy and power and all that stuff in relationships. And so, when we've got a collective that shows up with a sense of feeling unworthy of love or our own love, then that's going to get projected. That's going to be the energy that we're stepping into, and we've normalized it. So to go against that, is once again courageous. And I just really do want to encourage people once again that feeling, that thought that, I can't love myself because it's prideful or it's arrogant or it's all this stuff. Where'd that story come from? Like, who came up with that? And if you really start to trace it back, right, you just go, why do we believe that? And is there anything good that's come from that? And so, I do think you're right. It's a collective energy that we have, that we're all, mirroring, adopting, projecting, etc.
Well, and if it is a collective energy, then we also want to fit in. I mean, it's our human nature to want to fit in. So we don't want to be the one standing up saying, no, I'm amazing. I'm totally lovable. You want to commiserate. Yeah. It's just like when I mentioned like gossiping, it's like, it's like almost a way of bonding. So we can bond over that self-hatred versus over the self-love. Yeah. It's like you don't see people coming around celebrating one another. We tear each other down so much. And that goes into that comparison concept. It's like we're constantly trying to, I don't know if we're trying to one up each other or we're just trying to fit in or tear. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't serve anyone. Right. And we're not sitting here celebrating one another.
No, absolutely. And you're not feeling real good when you're sitting at your house all by yourself and you're beating the crap out of yourself and feeling horrible about yourself and you're trying to drink away that misery or medicate that misery away. And we're like, oh, but I can't love myself, but I can sure hate myself. That's okay. Like, how did that become a thing? Yeah, it's easier, right? And then we've all been in the conversations where, somebody who has, been projecting a certain level of energy or arrogance or whatever we want to call it. We all go, well, who do they think they are, right? And,
exactly.
They're always walking around like that. So we know those conversations happen and we're like, well, I don't want to be the person they're having that conversation about. But I have found, and the people who are living in and pressing into the practice of self-love, I don't find their presence to be arrogant. I don't find their presence to be one of haughtiness or, really self, aggrandizing or whatever the, words we'd want to use. There's actually seems to be a humility about them because I think in realizing that you can love yourself and you've come to that place of self-love, you also begin to realize that you didn't used to feel that way. And you were able to, do some work. And then it actually, because you're having love and compassion for yourself, you're actually extending that to other people. And you're able to be with other people in a way that is compassionate and more loving and more aware of, what they're going through. And so, I don't think we often have this image of self-love of somebody who's kind of walking around with all this confidence and doing this and that or whatever. And, this off-putting energy, which I don't find as being self-loving. I find that as compensating. But then there is that place of true at peace, at home, in your own presence, being able to love being in your own presence, which then allows you to relax and allows you to show up in a way that, just has a whole different energy that doesn't come across. And see, that's what I think we're afraid of. We associate self-love with that. image that we
Yeah.
have. There's another image. It's like, and you're in control of that image. In your mind, what would be the ideal image of you loving yourself? And then drop the cultural, perspective or the other narratives and stories that we have. Love the work of Byron Katie about being able to, like, is that true? Can you know that that's true around the word? Dropping the story. Can you drop the story of what self-love? I had to ask myself that question. Can you drop the story of what self-love has been told to you that it is? And can you go on an exploration to say, what would you want self-love to look like for you? And how would you want to show up in this world as a result of loving yourself? Yeah.
Well, that just made me think a lot of the fact of, I think the story we've told ourselves of what self-love is, I think we have it wrong. Self-love doesn't mean you're perfect. Self-love doesn't, if we really want to distill it down to what love is, it's, compassion, it's empathy, it's generosity, it's warmth, it's giving, all these like really good qualities. But for some reason, I think the narrative that we've built up around self-love is actually more like conceit. And so we just need to reframe. Maybe that's what we need to do on a bigger scale, is reframe what self-love is. Because like you said, those people that are coming off, showing themselves up as like these like egotistical people. And I think we label that as, oh, they love themselves so much.
Yeah.
They're actually compensating. They probably, and I'm speaking very generically here, but they probably don't have love for self. So we need to actually break down what it means to have self-love. And truly, self-love is unconditional. It's compassionate. It's accepting. It's means we're okay being flawed. We're okay changing our story. We're okay just allowing things to be. And we are okay in our present moment. And so maybe it's like reworking what the story of self-love is on a bigger scale. So we don't look at it as such a negative, because none of us want to be labeled as in that negative light.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's genius, Courtney. I think the idea of just how do you reframe, self-love and what it means, because words carry so much weight. And when we have this word, and it makes us afraid. It has all this baggage that gets associated with it. So how can we take the baggage off of it and go, what is love? Okay.
Yeah.
Love and compassion. And all we're saying is that I want to be able to show that kind of treatment to myself. When I mess up, I don't want to beat myself up for 2 weeks about it. I want to give myself the same compassion that I might give to somebody else. And I want to be as gentle with myself and as accepting of myself as I am with other people. And so that's the narrative, right? That's the story. And the podcast I do is called Permission to Love, because one of the things that I think that we're after is, how do I give myself permission to love myself? Because I think in all of our stuff that we're trying to show up in this world is like, I'm trying to get you to accept me. I'm trying to get you to like me. I'm trying to get you to tell me that I'm worthy. And if I can get enough of that like everybody else's validation, like, why do we seek so much external validation? In my opinion, is, one, it makes us feel good, usually temporarily, and then we go back to beating ourselves up. But we're trying to stack enough stories. We're trying to stack enough data and information from people that I'm actually lovable. I'm actually okay. And then what? I want to be able to then, from all of that, be able to say, I am lovable. So now I can love myself now. And so I'm trying to figure out how to give myself permission to love myself. My therapist, she said, in all of her years of working, she said, I think that really the ultimate thing that I'm trying to do as a therapist is teach people how to love themselves, to honor themselves and to love themselves. And so, in that you go, can I give myself permission to love myself? Well, I've got to understand that I can be worthy of that love. And then, like you said, change what that concept of self-love means. Because there are those barriers, there's those blockages, right?
Yeah.
And so each person's going to sit down and go, and that's why I use that word permission to love. Like, what are the things that are keeping you from giving yourself permission to love yourself? Let's list them. I did this and this happened, that happened, and this. And you go, okay. So then we can look at each one of those. I'm afraid to be labeled this or that, or I think self-love is arrogant. Okay. Then we can begin to look at the limiting beliefs that are behind each one of those. And then all of a sudden you go, I can finally give myself that permission to love myself. which isn't just sitting around for me in the room going, oh, I love myself now, all's well. It then allows me to show up in this world to bring more healing. It's not like you've just put mirrors all in your room and go, I love myself. Yeah, it's about now I can show up in the way that gives more love to other people. It can be a transformation of love in this world and really begin to bring my most authentic self, because you're not bringing your best authentic self when you're beating the crap out of yourself all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you're shaming yourself. You're showing up as this withdrawn, smaller version of who you are. And your love will heal you, and your love will unleash the best version of you. And I don't know anybody who would say that the best version of me wouldn't be about loving other people and bringing goodness into this world. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. And I love that you call your show Permission to Love. As a writer, I help others. I coach others with their writing, and I help people, what I say, unleash their voice, unleash their authentic voice. And the very first thing I do with all of my clients is make them sign a permission slip, or make is a little strong. I invite them to sign a permission slip to speak their truth, to get vulnerable and share their voice, because we don't give ourselves permission to do these things that connect us to our authenticity, that connect us to our vulnerability, love being one of those. So I think that is brilliant to, bring that permission. We have to give ourselves permission to go there. So I think that's beautiful. And I love the work you're doing. Where can we listen to your podcast, and where can we work with you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Courtney, for that. And it is a beautiful thing. I love that you're helping people get their authentic voice and giving themselves permission to be vulnerable and to speak. And thank you for all that you do to bring voices to the table about this. And so you can find my podcast on all the normal outlets, iTunes, Spotify. I also have a video podcast on YouTube, and you can find that at Jerry A. Henderson. And then the podcast, of course, Permission to Love. You can find me on Instagram at Jerry A. Henderson. You can also go to my website at jerryhenderson.org. You can find out more about the coaching program, other things that I do to work with people. And so, those are the main places that people can connect with the work, and be a real gift to be able to have people come and be a part of the community that we're building to normalize self-love.
I love it. Thank you so much. And speaking of love, congratulations. I know you just got married. So I hope you are in your newlywed bliss and loving every moment. And I really appreciate you taking your time today to talk to us.
Thank you, Courtney. Really appreciate you, and very grateful for you.
And that's it for today's Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Jerry Henderson, for such a lovely conversation all about self-love, compassion, and acceptance. If you want to work with Jerry or listen to his podcast, Permission to Love, I'll put all the information in the show notes below. And as always, you can find Intentional Living with Courtney Meyers and Intentional Media on our website at CourtneyMyers.com. That's where you'll find our books, courses, and everything else we have going on. I can't wait to talk to you soon. Bye.